Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm doing something new. I've got a book review for you of this work here by Benjamin Abelow, How the West Brought War to Ukraine. And the good news first, this book is not only a very competent overview of the myriad ways in which the West did provoke this war, it's also a book that is available for free. If you go to his homepage and you go to benjaminabelow.com/downloads, you find it available in English, German, and in French. Those three languages, and I recommend you downloading it because not only because it's free, but because it provides you with a short but concise overview of the many failings of the West, and not just failings, like the outright provocations. At this point, in the beginning, back in 2021, 22, I thought for myself that this war is the outcome. It's a tragedy. Nobody wanted it to happen, but then it happened anyway. And by now, we understand clearly, no, 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 no. This thing was planned and this provocation was planned and it was executed over many, many years. And Mr. Abelow actually does a very good job in very few pages to give us the historical trajectory and a lot of the flesh and bones of what you might need in order to argue this precise case. I think one of the most outstanding parts of the book is really its brevity while not compromising on important details. So the book is called How the West Brought War to Ukraine, understanding how US and NATO policies led to crisis, war, and the risk of nuclear catastrophe. And maybe one of the things to note here is that it was written and it was published in 2022. Mr. Abelow composed this right at the right when the war got going, when the special military operation started, and Russia went crossed Ukrainian borders and the big scale fighting started. I mean, you and I, we all know that there was fighting in Ukraine before, that this proxy and implementation war had been going on since 2014, the actual violence. But the big turning point, of course, came in 2022, also narratively in the West. Now, with this said, keep in mind this book was basically written at a point when everything was fresh and when the impression that Russia might lose this war was still very strong. And the first couple of chapters also show this, but let's talk about this later. The other one of the important features here is that the book is relatively short. Without the index citation and index and so on, it is 62 pages, and it's not long pages, and the language is very accessible, very written for a general audience, and still it contains a good number of footnotes and the necessary apparatus linking to other works and to the original sources in order to back up all or at least most of the claims made in the book. There are a couple of places in which I wish that Mr. Abelow had added more footnotes, but overall this is a fine and well crafted work. Overall, the book kind of competes at this point with the book by Scott Horton, which is whose title is Provoked, outrightly. And Scott Horton has included a ton and a ton of footnotes in his work and just referenced all of his sources. But Scott Horton's book is also much longer and much more detailed. So here with Benjamin Abelow's book, you've got a concise history and an accessible history of the this very much avoidable war in Eastern Europe. The good thing is he does start with an overview of the last 30 years. He begins in 1990s, the provocations back then, and there he mainly cites, quotes the many voices that counseled the United States against provoking Russia, against abandoning missile treaties, and against, of course, expanding NATO, especially. I mean, George Kennan and others are quoted in here. who all said we should not do this. He basically gives us a short rundown of the most important voices in the United States against the course of the then the Bush and later Clinton administrations to dismantle the late Cold War agreement on how to manage the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States, and now later, of course, then Russia and the United States. He doesn't go into the discussion of Francis Fukuyama and the end of history and what drove the United States to abandon the let's call it strategic respect toward Russia, but he does quite precisely show us what some of the utterances were, even of Russia hawks at the time, but all of who said that modern Russia, the 1990s Russia, is not the Soviet Union of the 1960s and 70s, and this is quite relevant. Then we go into Western Provocations 2014 to 2022, in which he talks about even more of these moments when the United States, also under the Trump administration, put in more weaponry into Ukraine, put very much offensive, defensive slash offensive equipment into Romania and Western NATO states, and the short discussion about one man's defense is another man's offense, or offense and defense depends very much on the eye of the beholder, and how all of these activities by NATO and the United States were viewed in Russia and the warnings that came from there. We then go into an exercise of thinking about what would happen if all of these things had happened the other way around, and it was the United States that was under similar predicaments. Something that also is often being done also here on YouTube, right? The argument that, just think about it, if China had a military alliance with Mexico, what would the United States do with Mexico if China tried to put medium-range missiles somewhere 70 kilometers off the borders of the United States? Just imagine for a second. And we then go to Russian concerns about U.S. fire strikes, which are real and which the Russians warned about time and again. Guys, US, NATO, we take this very seriously. This is no game. This is not fun. Stop it now. You are threatening our border. And how NATO time and again said, oh, but Russia, we are a defensive alliance. You have nothing to fear of us. You're imagining it. You're being paranoid. And how this entire narrative of a paranoid dictator in the Kremlin was fostered, right? Of course, Mr. Abelow actually uses the entire book to make that case, how the narrative about the war is actually driving the war. And it's even more commendable because he wrote this book in 2022. I mean, by now, 2025, most of us understand that this is a narrative-driven catastrophe, and it's not a tragedy again because this was very much intentionally done, and this was step by step escalated, and the level of provocation and misleading of the general public, of us, by complicit media outlets is mind-boggling. But so this part, all of this we understand now, but that Mr. Abelow framed it already as such a crime back in 2022 is very commendable. The last couple of chapters then discuss Russophobia, pessimistic narratives about self-fulfilling prophecies, how a lot of people saw this coming. A lot of people said, if you put troops there, the Russians will come. And in 2008, when NATO in the Bucharest summit promised that Ukraine and Georgia would become members, what happened? Georgia, Mr. Saakashvili, actually fired the first shots. His troops fired the first shots on Russian peacekeepers in these northern provinces, and then the 5-day war erupted. And if that hadn't been proof enough, the West just took this as a moment to reflect not on itself but on its capacities, so that this 5 day war was over in 5 days and couldn't be fought anymore. That's what bothered them, and not the fact that this is obviously escalation going on. And there's Mr. Abelow does a really good job at talking about this. The book is so short. There are a couple of references and things that fall by the wayside. I mean, he could have mentioned here that Georgia, the war in Georgia, the 5 day war, we have reports by independent fact finders, including a diplomat from my country, from Switzerland, Heidi Tagliavini, who wrote a report for the UN and said, like, well, it is undisputable that the first shots were fired by Saakashvili. And we have that report. It's out there. It's downloadable. You can get it. And still to this day, the heads of states in Europe, Mr. Scholz, a couple of half a year ago, and media outlets constantly repeat this lie that it was Russia that invaded and started the 5 day war in Georgia. It wasn't Russia. It wasn't. It's a lie. And we know about this lie, but the lie continues because the media is unaccountable. These people do not need to care what they write about, because nobody is because they don't need to do any repentance or any kind of there's no consequences for their constant untruths. So these things could also have been mentioned, but again, for the sake of brevity, Mr. Abelow chose to keep it short, and it all ends then on a quite interesting note, on page 60. Where are we here? 62. And I would just like to read this out to you. Policymakers in Washington and the European capitals, along with the captured craven media that uncritically amplify their nonsense, are now standing up to their hips in a barrel of vicious mud. How those who were foolish enough to step into that barrel will find the wisdom to extricate themselves before they tip the barrel and take the rest of us down with them is hard to imagine. And if we look at the entire tragedy of this situation right now, where we are in 2025 on May 16th, with negotiations going on in Istanbul, the same Istanbul and the same place, the same room even, where negotiations were had in 2022, and which again were sabotaged by the West and by Boris Johnson and by NATO, which said, no, we're gonna fight this war. You, Ukraine, you fight, we send weapons. Um, just thinking about this, how 3 years of time and hundreds of thousands of lives of Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers were sacrificed for the grandstanding of NATO. That just makes you angry. And getting this book, you don't get the 3 years, you get the prelude to that. But already the prelude just shows the insincerity and the utter moral abyss over which these NATO countries fell, and not just fell, they just plunged themselves into this. We now have so much proof, just so much. I mean, okay, sorry, I just need to show you again this one. Then if you Google New York Times and CIA Ukraine, you get these articles of the spy war, how the CIA secretly helps Ukraine fight, or the secret history of the war in Ukraine. I mean, these things are now just out there in the open. This is the article that talks about how the Ukraine war was fought by the US from a command center in Wiesbaden. And they there's even New York Times articles about this. I mean, they're not hiding it anymore, and not even hiding it anymore. They are proud of the fact. Of course, this article is a horrible piece of propaganda because it tries to argue that, oh, we heroically supported the Ukrainians. Look at how brave our American military is because we are supporting our friend. But it just speaks to the myriad ways and to the long history, of which Ukraine has been militarized to the teeth, and how right-wing extremist elements have been empowered. And then once the war started, how the operational planning of the war has all been done in by the United States, by NATO, and the political effort that was done to further arm Ukraine and fight the war against Russia through Ukraine is just mind-boggling again. And that's why I don't call this a proxy war anymore. I call this an implementation war because Russia was fighting itself on the for its side of the bargain. Ukraine is the implementation partner of the of that war that the Western alliance said if Russia doesn't back down, then we'll fight a war. So and the war they are fighting, and they're still keeping on fighting. The thing that changed by now, by 2025, is that we have Donald Trump in the White House, who actually doesn't want to fight the war anymore, but it already has a dynamic of its own, and we are seeing how difficult it is to bring this to an end. Not just because Donald Trump is not using the most straightforward way to end it, which would be to just pull the plug, but because you get yourself into an entire network of warmongers who still want to continue this, especially the Europeans at the moment, who would rather see every single Ukrainian dead than actually ending this war on terms that are not favorable to Western preferences, right? And that's the tragedy. If you, as an implementation partner, make yourself the tool of great powers, then you must not expect that these great powers will spare you because your life is worth nothing. Um, and the repercussions of this war are borne mostly by the Ukrainians, of course, while the implementation partners in the background, the Germans and the French and the British and the Americans, they don't suffer. They might have economic troubles like the Europeans, but in case of the United States, they even have a wartime boom, right? Because all of their implements of war, all of their weapons keep flowing to Ukraine. So this was a little excursion into just how absolutely horrible this is. I recommend Mr. Abelow's book. And by the way, one of the important things about this book is also that it chronicles the history, and it chronicles all the people who said like stop this. This is madness. And we have a lot of those. It matters. So don't let anyone tell you that we didn't know. Coincidentally, this very channel here. Um, I started this channel 3 years ago. I started it in early February 2022. Coincidentally, I mean, doing this for real. If you go to the page of neutrality studies, what you find before February 2022 is my channel filled with pictures like these, which were my academic webinars that I did, or academic interviews with. It was mostly webinars actually at the time when I organized for people to come on and talk about this. The first person I ever interviewed under my new format was this gentleman here 3 years ago, the last U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, Ambassador Jack Matlock. You can see how I here changed my design, my thumbnail design, and I stuck more or less to it since then. And Mr. Jack Matlow, what surprised me at the time is that he explicitly said, NATO expansion was a mistake. This is a quote. He said it was a mistake, and he explained it in all detail. And at the time, Russia the special military operation hadn't started yet. There was no invasion yet. It was yet the Ukraine crisis. So we talked about the crisis because the crisis was ongoing. And we talked about that one. And he pointed also toward NATO and said, like, look, that should never have been done. And these voices are there. And if you want to watch another video, by the way, that might interest you from 3 years ago, watch this one too. Former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Robert Hunter, on the Russo-Ukrainian War. Robert Hunter was, he was United States Ambassador to NATO back during the Bucharest summit. Not the Bucharest summit, he was there before that, but he told me that when he heard that the Bucharest summit actually made a commitment to Ukraine, he said, like, that's the moment of commitment. That's the moment they said that. They put in motion, NATO put in motion an entire counter reaction from Russia that is unavoidable, even without making Ukraine a member state, but just by issuing the pronouncement that in 2008 that the goal was to make Ukraine and Georgia members. That is the moment of commitment. So These are just moments to show that no, it was not at all a unprovoked war. The opposite is true. It is a provoked war, and it is an implementation war, and it is a war of NATO against Russia. And the people who are fighting these wars, not the soldiers on the ground, the politicians in charge, they understand that. This is also why it is so weird, so bizarre that the United States tries to frame itself as a neutral mediator between Russia and Ukraine. It is obviously not. The reason why the Russians go along with this charade is because they understand that in order to end the war in Ukraine, you actually need the agreement and the collaboration of the United States, right? If these two come to an arrangement among themselves, then an end to the fighting in Ukraine will follow because you can pull the plug on this travesty. And that's what's needed, a pulling of the plug of the travesty from the NATO side, and from the United States first and foremost. It is questionable whether that will happen. The discussions in Istanbul, at this point, they look not very hopeful since the NATO side is already trash talking it big time and interpreting Vladimir Putin not coming as a slap in the face of Mr. Zelensky, although it is Mr. Zelensky who said like, oh, only direct talks with Russia's leader are acceptable. I mean, this is not how negotiations work. You don't negotiate on the top level. You sign on the top level, but you negotiate the details, obviously, by people familiar with the details and each respectable each counterpart on both sides, right? Militarily and diplomatically. But the implementation war is still ongoing, and there's a good number of people in Europe and in the US who want to continue the implementation war. And the book by Mr. Abelow really helps us. Again, if you wanna download it, go to benjaminabelow.com/downloads. The book exists in English, German, and in French. It is well worth downloading and a read, or even just keeping it on your hard drive as a resource for the future if somebody again wants to pretend that this was not a provoked war. It was. And with that, I wish you a good afternoon.